In rising to speak on this legislation, I'm reflecting that it's sad that the pattern of this legislation is so familiar. It's a pattern we've got used to. It's a pattern of a government that is focusing its attacks on the people that can least afford to be attacked, focusing its attacks on the poorest in our society, the people that need support, and ignoring the potential ways of balancing our budget by looking at the big end of town. We are here in this legislation. There are attacks on workers, there are attacks on older people, and there's attacks on science and development. And the measures that are laid out in this legislation are going to save a relatively measly amount of money. In comparison, if we had a government that was serious about really looking at where the money could be coming from, how it could be balancing the budget, it would be looking at things like making our superannuation system fairer and saving billions of dollars in doing that. It would be doing things like removing fossil fuel subsidies and saving billions of dollars in doing that. And it would be looking at things like increasing the tax on the big profits of the big four banks. These sorts of measures, revenue-raising measures, are the sorts of things that would be really making a difference in balancing our budget. But instead we have got an ideological attack on the people that can least afford to pay. The Greens are committed to maintaining strong protections for Australian workers and the industries that support them. So in this bill, we're seeking to amend this bill, and we will be opposing the changes to the seafarers tax offset. We will be opposing the research and development tax offset changes and the mature age worker tax offset changes. I want to start with the seafarers tax offset. Schedule 2 of this bill proposes to abolish this. In its current form, the seafarers tax offset applies to seafarers in the company's ship which have the appropriate certificate and where the company employs the crew member for at least 91 days a year for these journeys. And this tax incentive goes a long way to ensuring that workers on overseas journeys can get a decent pay, and it keeps their jobs viable, and it costs us the measly sum of $2 million a year. For the sake of $2 million a year, the government is continuing to be applying measures that are going to be making it more and more difficult to employ Australian workers on our seas, to have Australian-flagged ships plying our coast. You can see that there are all sorts of measures that are all coming together. They're going to end basically coming together to completely decimate the Australian shipping industry. And that will be a disaster. It will be a disaster for the Australian workforce, but also a disaster for us having good working conditions and safe environmental conditions for the ships that are in our waters. For this, it's a tiny saving that the government is trying to achieve, and for that it's going to ditch security for workers and our shipping industry at the very time that they need our support. We mustn't let it happen. Right now, what the Australian shipping industry needs is certainty. The industry is awaiting the results of the Minister's options paper. The last thing that they need is to be forced to negotiate the storm that abolishing this tax incentive would create. The policy as it stands at the moment, which is going to be abolished, also promotes professional development and training of workers by including this in the period deemed to be on a voyage. And this is essential. It's an essential measure to be training up and essential to be giving our Australian shipping workers the know-how to maintain our status as a major shipping nation. It's a status that we don't need to let go. We have got options. There are ways forward, constructive ways forward, that we can be maintaining a strong, healthy, viable Australian shipping industry with good working conditions for the seafarers and with good environmental protections. And perhaps most importantly, what an Australian shipping industry can be is a shipping industry that's competitive with the rest of the world, because it needs to be that. It truly is an international business. The industry operates in a market that's largely tax-free in international terms, and which other players, other countries, other seafarers on other countries' ships are given similar tax incentives. So to take away this benefit from our workers will be putting them at a disadvantage to the rest of the world, just when we need to be doing everything we can in order to be maintaining their jobs. The government argues that the seafarers tax offset has had a low uptake. But while uptake numbers might appear low at first glance, the reality is that it reflects the small number of Australian ships operating internationally. We need to be maintaining those ships, and we need to be increasing the number of Australian ships operating. Now, at the moment, we've got a small number of ships, but it's a vital industry and a tax measure that we must keep. Schedule 1 of this bill abolishes the mature age tax offset and removes access to this incentive for older workers to remain in the workforce. Up to a million Australians are receiving this at the moment. We all know the challenges that Australia is facing from our ageing population, and we need to be doing whatever we can to be supporting older Australians continuing to participate in the workforce. We know that the government knows that that's what they're trying to do. We've seen in the media this week measures to try and maintain and encourage older Australians to stay in the workforce. The mature age tax offset puts $500 in the pocket of mature age workers as an extra incentive to get them to stay in the workforce. And we don't accept that ripping out $760 million from older Australian workers is a fair thing to do. It's part of the Abbott government's unfair budget cuts that this is part of. The Greens are committed to improving older Australians' access and participation in work, and believe that the government needs to be doing more, not less, including supporting employers where it's appropriate. Because of this, the Greens are going to be moving to amend this bill to remove this schedule from the bill. Schedule 3 of the bill, of course, continues the Abbott government's attacks on science and research and development. The bill cuts 1.5% from the research and development offsets available to businesses and rips $620 million out of research and development spending over the forward estimates. This, again, is just what we don't need to be doing to be having a prosperous Australia. We know that increasing investment in science and research is the way forward. We know that our well-being, our security, our economic viability as a nation depends on this research, and it depends on having an innovative economy that's using our brains. That's where we're going to be able to continue to compete on the world stage. The government tries to justify this cut by saying it brings it into line with business tax cuts also outlined in the budget. But this cut will occur a year before those possible tax cuts, and the passage of those tax cuts through the Senate are of course by no means certain. And of course, these cuts to research and development also come on top of the cuts to the R&D tax offset that targeted large company investment that recently passed the Senate. This is insanity. It is in totally the direction that we shouldn't be going. And the insanity of these cuts, it's reinforced, it's underlined by the government's own figures on science expenditure. Just as we know that science increasingly needs to be underpinning our future as a nation, over the last few decades, we are set to spend less this year than we did in 1979. We know that over the past few decades, science and research has become increasingly important to our society and economy. The rot began under Labor in 2012, but Tony Abbott is taking spending on science and research to the equal lowest level since records began. We've had cuts to CSIRO. CSIRO scientists have been taking voluntary redundancy packages across the country. CSIRO scientists that have been working for decades are now no longer going to be having their contribution to our country used and valued. We've seen cuts to clean energy programs, and the cuts to the tax concessions for R&D, such as the cuts in this bill, have contributed to this woeful result of spending on science and research being the equal lowest level since records began. We'll never be able to compete with China or India on wages, but we have the potential to be stronger on research and innovation, and that needs secure and significant public investment, something that other countries have certainly twigged onto. We're trailing way behind countries that are our competitors in the world, countries like Germany, the UK, the US, and we're outspent by key trading partners like Korea and Japan. A few weeks ago, I visited a car component manufacturer in Adelaide, Precision Components, who are trying to work out how they can survive with the car industry disappearing in Australia. They are desperate to try and maintain their business. They are desperately trying to be innovators and to be really doing a lot of research and development to discover new markets for themselves. They told me that now some 50% of their workforce are now employed in engineering, as opposed to the workers on the factory floor actually manufacturing the products. 50% of them in the engineering part of the business. This is the sort of business that needs to be supported by research and development grants. That means we can be having the innovation that will allow Australia to continue to compete on the world stage and continue to be providing jobs for Australians. If we keep cutting spending on science, on research and innovation, and these spending cuts are happening because it's seen as being something that no one will notice. It's just a little bit about, and the scientists aren't going to complain very much, and no one's going to think about it. But if we keep doing this, the country's brain drain is going to continue. And we're going to wake up after the mining boom to find out that we're a hollowed-out, uneducated quarry with nothing left to sell to the rest of the world. The Greens will always be committed to Australian workers and maintaining innovation in our key industries. And that's why we are seeking to amend this bill to remove these idealistic attacks on our workers.